Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Sense Signal podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Dan Tarker, and this podcast is all about leadership and sense making. And so today's episode, we're going to talk about the metacrisis, which I know everybody loves talking about. You can't escape the metacrisis. It's the hot topic on everyone's channel these days. So we're going to talk about that. And we're also going to talk about non-teleological thinking and how that can help us navigate the metacrisis, how we can use non-teleological thinking to make better sense of the world so that we can make better leadership decisions. Now, this podcast, we are always up for trying new things, and I'm kind of tweaking my approach for this episode. I'm just going to be riffing and talking about some thoughts I've had on the metacrisis and non-teleological thinking. We don't have a guest on this episode. Guests take a lot of time to book and schedule, so it's going to take some time to get that up and running again, but we will start having guests on the show again. Definitely want to curate them so they really speak to some of the themes that we're trying to tackle this year. And one of the big things I do want to tackle this year more deeply than we have in the past, the past year, is this concept of the metacrisis. And, what tools can we use to navigate it? And I do think non-teleological thinking, and hopefully that's not too scary of a word, sometimes scares me. Sometimes it scares me to even say it. Non-teleological. I want to make sure I get the emphasis right so I don't sound like a complete fool here on the interwebs, which is easy to do, as I just did. So what is the metacrisis? For those of you who aren't aware, we are, to some folks, in this period of human history called the metacrisis, where all these different crises are converging together to create one large, major crisis to humanity as we seem to be barreling toward mass extinction. Yes, mass extinction is what we're talking about. And I'm not just saying that to get clicks, because I do know mass extinction will get us some clicks, because people are fascinated by extinction stories, especially human extinction stories. Those TV shows like 25 Days After Humanity's Gone, what will happen? So I know it'll get clicks, but no, this is the real thing. People really believe that all these crises, global conflict like Israel and Hamas and the Palestinian situation, the Ukraine wars, North Korea, Taiwan and China threatening to invade there. All these global crises are happening that are war focused. And then we also have the climate crisis. The temperature of the oceans are increasing. We're going to see more climate change. It's going to reshape our society. Then we have a crisis of truth, a crisis of reality in a sense, because of the media. Nobody trusts the media anymore. We have low trust in our institutions. It seems like everything is breaking down around us, and we're coming to a critical point in humanity where it's hard to make sense of the world. Hence, one of the reasons for this podcast, how do leaders make sense of the world? And then on top of that, you have global pandemics, you have all these other issues and atomization of society. We're all fragmented in our little bubbles, and it's just, I think there is a good cause for describing this era that we're living in as a metacrisis. And how do we navigate a world like that? Because ultimately, this metacrisis is born out of the complexity of our reality, right? We live in a very complex reality that we are not designed to navigate. We are still animals, right? We're evolved. I watched the movie Altered States over the weekend, the great William Hurt, Blair Brown film, I think directed by Ken Russell. And if you remember in that movie, he's a scientist. William Hurt plays a scientist who goes into an isolation chamber and takes these mushrooms that he gets from a tribe down in Mexico and begins to have these visions inside the isolation chamber. And he kind of regresses to his primal form. And not only does he go back deep into his genes to tap into this kind of shared memory, or this collective memory that this story argues exists within our genes. He also transforms. It's kind of like a werewolf movie in a sense, except a more sophisticated one, because he transforms into a primal creature. And there's this whole chase scene. He beats up a security guard, gets chased by dogs. breaks into a zoo and eats a lamb, and then wakes up naked, like a werewolf character the next day. It's kind of, yeah, it really is a sophisticated werewolf story. But I'm sharing that to get to the idea of, we are not that far away from our ancestors on the savannah. And so our brains and our senses are still geared toward making sense of the world through those lenses, and we still have those primal states. One of the things William Hurt talks about in that movie is when he is in that primal state, when he is that ancestor of ours, the needs, the consciousness is very squarely focused on, just needs like food, water, probably sex too. I mean, and those kind of things, and survival, fighting the dogs off and scurrying over a fence to escape a pack of wild dogs on the street. So it's all very primal, and there's no complexity to this creature's thinking. And so that's us at our prime base level, right? And so as we've grown as a species, as we've evolved, we've created culture, we've created systems and bureaucracies and governments and all these complex systems and things that keep our society functioning and moving forward. But at the same time, the technology piece of that we've been advancing for hundreds of years, it's kind of outpacing evolution, or where we are at evolutionarily speaking, especially our minds, our consciousness, our senses. Because when you're on the savannah, when you're just out trying to catch some wildebeest for lunch, you don't need to have high resolution senses, right? You just need to know what's right in front of you. Can I track it? Can I guess where it's going so I can make a plan of attack to get that food? That's basically what you need. But in our world, technology and society have become so complex that our senses and our minds can no longer keep up. And that's a huge part of this so-called metacrisis, that we just don't have the capacity to keep up with the complexity anymore. And so I think of the Israeli Palestinian conflict that's happening today as part of this, right? So a lot of people ask me, or others, or maybe nobody asks me, but I'll share this, because nobody asks me anything, really. You're not asking me anything. I don't even know why you're listening. You might want to change the channel. So why don't you care more about this? Why aren't you out in the streets protesting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And a lot of people are probably asking each other that. And it was interesting. I was in a bar the other day, because I like bars. I go there often and have a beer. And I overheard somebody say, you know what? To somebody else at the table, I feel like I agree with my dad. They were talking about their dad. And they were like saying, I agree with my dad that these things just happen. There's nothing you can really do with them. Do about it, and you can protest it, but what's happening is so beyond you that it's hard to do anything about it. And let's face it, you could go out and protest. We've been seeing, as a Gen Xer, we've been seeing this for years. We've been through Iraq, we've been through Vietnam, we've been through all these different wars and conflicts that pull people out in the street and launch mass protests. But do they ever really have an impact? Gen X, we're cynical people. We're the cynical generation. So it's hard to get us really passionate about a world that we're already cynical about. So, and I think the other layer of why it's hard to get really, for some of us, if you're looking for an explanation, for some of us, why it's hard to get really passionate about it is not that we're unfeeling. It's not that we don't feel like this is a terrible, horrific, monstrous situation. But it's also hard because it's hard to make sense of the situation, because we no longer have trust in the media, so we no longer trust what we're being told. We're crisis fatigued. That's another layer of it. We've just had COVID. We've had the Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan situation going on for years. We've had a great recession. We've had a lot of things to get up in arms and in crisis mode about. And I think people are just crisis wary too. And then there's this whole metacrisis. It seems like the whole world's caving in, and this is just one more damn thing on our plate to have to worry about. So that's a whole nother ball of wax around this idea of the metacrisis. So you're probably asking, well, Dan, you said at the beginning we're going to talk about non-teleological thinking and how that can help us with the metacrisis. And I do think one of the answers to resolving our feelings and our sense-making approach around the metacrisis does lie in non-teleological thinking. So I'm going to shift now and let the metacrisis rant go for a little bit, and the rant about just the world situation go, and talk a little bit about non-teleological thinking and how I understand it, at least. So I was introduced to non-teleological thinking from the log from the Sea of Cortez, written by John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts, even though Ed Ricketts doesn't really get credit on the cover. That was a change by the publisher after Ricketts died in, I think, 1948. Because I think the original plan was to have him as co-author. We're not going to get into that in this podcast, but we are going to talk about chapter 14 of this log from the Sea of Cortez. And chapter 14 is where Steinbeck and Ricketts outline their conception of non-teleological thinking. And and I think it's, a lot of people aren't familiar with John Steinbeck maybe these days. So I'll give a brief bio. Nobel Prize winner for The Grapes of Wrath Grapes of Wrath was really a protest novel about Okies, people from Oklahoma escaping the Dust Bowl and going into California to work in the fields, the grape fields specifically, and the horrible working conditions they experienced and the oppression that they had to survive through as they were, migrant workers in California. He's also famous for a lot of other works of Mice and Men, East of Eden, To a God Unknown. Probably To a God Unknown's a lesser one, but there's just a ton of them. Cannery Row. But yeah, so you have Steinbeck, who's this great writer, and his best friend, Ed Ricketts, or best friend at the time, Ed Ricketts. And I would say, no, maybe best friend in literary history. Right? These are two giants in literary history, even though you probably have never heard of Doc Ricketts. And Ed Ricketts was a marine biologist. He didn't have his doctorate. He dropped out of the University of Chicago and moved to Monterey to start up the Western Biological Laboratory, which was just a shack there on Monterey, where he would go out into the tide pools and collect sea anemone and mollusks and octopi and starfish and all kinds of creatures, and store them in his laboratory and sell them to different universities and research departments. That was kind of his gig. Kind of a threadbare, scruffy looking fella, but was really beloved by the Cannery Row community, which is a far cry from the Cannery Row community today, which is more of a tourist trap. Lots of shops, restaurants, Bubba Gumps. But it's not back then it was more of a working class, very poor community filled with, basically shacks and warehouses and canneries, working stiffs, prostitutes, drunks, bums, ne'er-do-wells, and people like Ed Ricketts and John Steinbeck, who would hang out at Ed Ricketts' lab, drink beers, cook some steaks, and talk about philosophy and art and music and all kinds of different things. Really, you could consider it a literary salon housed in this kind of ramshackle marine biology lab. And actually, interesting anecdote to that is Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist Joseph Campbell, hung out there too. You might remember Joseph Campbell for the books Hero with a Thousand Faces and other great groundbreaking books and mythology. And a lot of his thinking around mythology also was crystallized, apparently, in a lot of his conversations with Ed Ricketts. Because Ed Ricketts was really more than just a marine biologist. He was a philosopher, and he came up with this idea of non-teleological thinking that informs chapter 14 of the log from the Sea of Cortez. And he actually, I think, published different versions or wrote different versions of this essay that ended up becoming the 14th chapter. So Steinbeck frames the 14th chapter as a break in their trip down the West Coast on the Western, I think it was the Western Flyer, which was a sardining ship they hired to take them down on this expedition from Monterey all the way down to the Sea of Cortez, where they're going to collect specimens. And Steinbeck writes this travel log about their adventures and the observations of sea life and human life as well on the trip. And in chapter 14, they take a pause on a beach, apparently. I think it's a literary convention that he does. He frames it like this because we know the content has already been written elsewhere. But he frames it like, okay, we're stopping at this beach on Easter Sunday, and we're going to talk about non-teleological thinking, because that's what you do on Easter Sunday. You sit on the beach, crack open some beers, and talk about teleology. That's how I like to spend my Sundays on Easter Sundays as well. Um, but it's a fascinating concept. And, teleology goes back as a concept, maybe not a word, because the word was actually coined in the 1800s, teleology. And I think it was probably coined to help wrestle with Darwin's approach to origin of thinking and sense making around origin of species. But we'll get to that in a moment. But you can track teleology back to the beginnings of humanity and storytelling, really. I mean, we are teleological thinkers. And all teleology really means is that you're framing your sense making around purpose and goals. Like you're viewing everything in reality as if there's a set of goals and a very direct series of cause and effect actions that are happening for a purpose. So if we think about our great mythologies, the Greek mythologies, if you even go back to our first mythology and the Sumerians with Gilgamesh, to the Abrahamic traditions like Christianity, the Muslim faith, and the Jewish faith, they all are very teleological. They're all looking to create an understanding of reality through how we've evolved to make sense of the world, which is very cause and effect oriented, and trying to find purpose and meaning in the world. So we might use, in the old days, gods and myths to try to make sense of the world and explain the different phenomenon, especially inexplicable phenomenon we are experiencing, because there must be a purpose to it all, right? There must be. Well, from a non-teleological perspective, maybe there's not. And I think that's something we're going to have to wrestle with too, in the metacrisis sense. So you have this idea of teleology, and Aristotle picks it up too, and kind of abandons the God to agree, although he, I do think he believed in a God, but begins to explain natural phenomena, things in nature, through a teleological cause and effect toward a purpose lens. But with Darwin, and this is probably why, as a marine biologist, Ed Rickett was fascinated with non-teleological thinking, because he was deeply steeped in Darwinism and natural selection. That when Darwin publishes The Origins of Species, he's publishing and he's presenting his ideas in a way that is very unfamiliar to people, because it's non-teleological. It's not saying that there's a cause and effect to the way creatures evolve. It's an adaptation based on the fit with the environment, and it's looking at population levels and things like that. And so there's no purpose to it, right? Evolution's not moving toward a specific goal. Unfortunately, whether you like it or not, evolution is indifferent to your survival. I mean, ultimately, it wants the genes to survive and move forward, but your individual survival, it doesn't really care about that. It's really concerned with the population, if it is even concerned at all. It's a metaphor for describing the processes of nature and how creatures, life forms evolve. So you have Ed Ricketts and Steinbeck sitting on their fictionalized beach, drinking their beers and talking about this non-teleology on an Easter afternoon. Definitely deeply informed by Darwin's Origins of Species. So what is non-teleological thinking? Well, in contrast to teleological thinking, non-teleological thinking really embraces the complexity and interconnectedness of the world. So it pushes back against the explanations that are directly cause and effect and look for a purpose. It's really rooted in probably Taoism, for sure. Taoism probably influenced it, because they use the language of is thinking. It just is. What is happening just is. And I really feel like, one of the positive impacts of COVID is a change in people's perspective. And it's a very subtle one. I don't know if people are noticing it, but this idea of is thinking is starting to take some root. And I hear it most of the expression, it is what it is. It is what it is, right? I mean, it kind of reminds me of that saying the term, the language that Kurt Vonnegut uses in a Slaughterhouse Five. So it goes, right? It's what the refrain is in Slaughterhouse Five. It's kind of a nihilistic, like, so it goes. Everyone got bombed, so it goes. Everyone died, so it goes. Kind of the same thing with it is what it is, right? This terrible event happened. There's a car accident up the street that blocked traffic for 9 hours. It is what it is. The heating and water in this building just completely shut off in the middle of the day, and we got to work in freezing cold temperatures. It is what it is. it's you see it all the time. You hear that phrase all the time, and it's kind of an expression of resignation. But that is also at the root of this non-teleological approach to thinking. It's just not looking at why things happen, because you can't explain why something happens. There's no purpose to it. There's no why. There's no real answer to the question why. Why do we exist? There's no answer to that. But you can ask how and what. How did something happen? What happened? You can get to the facts of the case in a non-teleological approach. But the non-teleological position is don't look for a purpose to it all, because there's not going to be one, and it's a useless avenue of thinking, because you're going to fall into the trap of cause and effect thinking, versus the non-teleological approach, which embraces the world is a complex place. We're all living in our interconnected tide pools. You can view your community as a tide pool of interconnected relationships, and things happen in that place, and they are what they are. And you can ask how they happened, or you can ask what happened. This thing happened, and you can ask how it happened. Going down the why, black hole is, it's not going to get you anywhere, right? It's a bottomless pit. And so Steinbeck and Ricketts are arguing for this position. And they do point out, like, some people might say some could view this as very uncaring and nihilistic view of the world. And I reject that too. They reject it, and I reject that too as well. And they actually say it's going to lead to a place of more caring and compassion, because you're not trying to blame anybody for something that's happening. When you're looking at why, you're looking at blame. You caused this because you did this. Whereas non-teleological thinking is viewing the world more complexly and saying things happen because they're outgrowths of a combination of different things that you might be seeing and you might not be seeing. And that's really where data comes in. And I guess that gets back again to the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the apathy of some people, the perceived apathy of some people. I think getting back to these ideas around the metacrisis, there's this concept of pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic thinking. And pre-tragic thinking is when you're filled with hopium. We've used there's that term on this show before. It's one of our key terms on this podcast, hopium. And that's where you're really excited about something and optimistic. The tech industry is usually filled with lots of hopium. And usually we all are when we're launching new projects or things like that. Then you move from that pre-tragic position or hopium position to the tragic position, where inevitably humanity messes things up. We F things up all the time, and things fall apart. And then after that, you get to the post-tragic mindset or position. And that's where I really think I am, and I think a lot of other people, when there's a perceived apathy about a political position or political situation or global crisis that everyone else is up in arms about. And the post-tragic is really getting to that non-teleological way of thinking. And it is that there is always going to be tragedy in this world. It's baked in. I mean, you look for justice. There's never going to be justice in this world. That's never going to happen. There's no state that humanity will get to that is going to be perfect. There will never be perfection. It's just not going to happen. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue good things and making the world a better place. That is actually the opposite. But getting up in arms to the level that some people do isn't actually going to help. And so, like, I'm going to say it, getting out in the middle of I-5 or a highway and protesting isn't helping anybody. It's not helping anybody. So stop it. What you have power to do, what we all have power to do, is make the world that we live in, that's right in front of us, directly around us, a better place. That's what we can do. And there's a ripple effect to that, hopefully, that you can start to expand your orbit of making the world a better place around you, touch other people, and expand. But to try to, when you have these global things that are moving us forward, it's madness to think that, even getting 1,000 people out on the highway to squat there and block traffic is really going to have any tangible effect when the forces that are after us, or that are moving us in this direction in history that we're going, are so beyond our control. So beyond our control. And that gets us to the idea, and the Metacrisis, of moloch, right? The moloch is the metaphor they use to describe those invisible forces that are driving the Metacrisis and driving humanity potentially to its own extinction. And Moloch is, going back to the Bible, Moloch is the god of, and they don't really believe it's a god. I want to emphasize that. It's a metaphor, but getting back to its etymological roots, Moloch is a god from the Old Testament, or at least mentioned there. And there's archaeological evidence for there was a cult of Moloch, and the cult sacrificed children to this deity, right? So for protection, or getting back to that very teleological thinking, in order to protect our community, we need to sacrifice our children to this bronze statue deity. And it's going to protect them. I mean, again, also gets back to kind of the post-tragic perspective of the world, right? That these things, I mean, it's all throughout history, terrible things have happened in the world, and they're going to continue to happen, and you just have to learn to cope with it and make the world around you a better place. Anyways, in your immediate vicinity, a better place. So Moloch, again, so we have Moloch in the Old Testament. And then you have him again in the Allen Ginsburg poem, Howl. The greatest minds of my generation have been reduced to madness. That's not a perfect quote, but that's gets to some of the flavor of that poem. And it's a beatnik poem from I think the early 1960s, maybe late 50s. And he's talking about, the people in his generation being driven to madness. And he's talking about heroin. And he's also talking about just the machine of civilization and capitalism that's driving us over the edge and driving us to madness. So you have the Ginsburg use of Moloch. And now recently, it's been appropriated for the Metacrisis as a descriptor of all those forces pushing us toward madness, pushing us toward extinction, pushing us toward the crumbling of society. And it's we've talked on the show also about the concept of like the egregore, the collective consciousness that we all contribute to, or the collective consciousness that we all contribute to that becomes more than the sum of us, and also then feeds back down into us and indoctrinates us into this cultural thing, kind of a mystical concept. But I think there is truth to it. And Moloch is part of that, right? I mean, that way of thinking, that there are these invisible forces that we can't see that are impacting us and moving us in this way. So that's part of the Metacrisis thing too. And I think part of what Moloch does, that's very teleological, right? Because it's thinking that the Moloch is doing anything. And Moloch doesn't really care. It's like any force in the universe or any construct we come up with to try and describe and make sense of what's going on in the universe. can't be a teleological thing because it's not conscious. It doesn't have a purpose. And so, but these forces are driving us toward this end, and it's fascinating that part of Moloch is this creation of atomization and uncertainty and low trust in news sources and government and experts, and creating this environment where we can't trust anything except what's right in front of us, right? And and I guess that gets back to that post-tragic perspective in the case of the Metacrisis. That, man, what can I do but just make the world around me a better place and be aware that I do not have the capacity to truly make sense of the reality in front of me. And that again gets back to the Altered States movie and gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this episode, or this little monologue that I'm improvising, that that we just don't have the world has become so complex that our minds and our senses are low resolution anyhow, because we don't need to be able to see all of reality. We don't need to be able to see it, hear it, taste it, touch it. So our senses have been evolved to have limited input, right? And then our brains are evolved to make predictions about the data that's coming in, to give us what we need, and make guesses about what we need to be able to perceive in order for us to navigate the world in which we live. And again, the world just becomes so complex that we're breaking down. It's becoming harder and harder to do that. So I'm going to argue, and that's been the purpose of this whole monologue, is that teleological thinking is one of the avenues I think we can explore as a sense-making approach to making sense of reality, and not trying to view everything in terms of cause and effect, but really looking at the world as a complex, interconnected system, where we have to be open to the true facts and the false facts and everything in between, in order to make sense of the world. And the key, I think, one of the keys, and research is bearing this out too. In order to think non-teleologically, you need to be in a quiet space. You need to have time, because it's not time. It is time consuming to think it through, to think through the complexity, to look at all the different explanations of a particular phenomenon, that are to look at all the different explanations for a particular phenomenon. So it does take time and some isolation, I'd imagine, too, to get to that non-teleological space. Because, studies show that when you put somebody in a crisis event and they have to make fast decisions, they're going to snap right back to a teleological cause and effect, purposeful mindset, right? That's because that's how we've evolved to make sense of reality. I mean, and you could see that. I mean, the best evidence for that it's an evolutionary adaptation, is literature, is storytelling, is our movies. All of that are teleological ways of seeing the universe. But the universe really isn't that way, right? Reality is not that way. The reality is non-teleological, and getting to an understanding of it requires a mindset that pushes us in that direction. And as we continue on this journey into the meta-crisis, non-teleological thinking, I'm going to guarantee, is the way we've got to go. But that takes effort. That takes mental discipline. And I'm hoping that we can, as we continue this podcast this year, we can have more conversations about how we can look at the world more complexly, to make sense of it, and to make the world that we can actually engage with a better place. So in closing, I want to harken back to an earlier podcast we did on Milan Kundera, the Czechoslovakian novelist who died last year. We had one of the books we talked about in a podcast a while ago was his book Immortality. And in that, he introduces the idea of imageology as opposed to ideology, as a form of thinking, or as a form of expressing how we're being delivered information. And ideology is a set of principles and ideas that kind of inform our perspectives about the world. And he's arguing he argues, and this is in the 1990s, that ideology has been long since died. And now we live in a world of imageology where all the complexity of the former ideologies have been drained from them. And then you have a bunch of slogans to replace that. We're probably familiar with that. That gets back to activism and stuff like that, where concept things are broken down, reduced, complex things are reduced to slogans. And that, that's what it is. And it is what it is. Remember, it is what it is. And so you were inundated with these images by, in his time was just television and probably the emergence of cable TV and stuff like that. Now we have broadened even further and more atomization created around it with social media, Facebook, Instagram, X, formerly Twitter, and Threads. Who's on Threads? Is anyone really on Threads? TikTok, all these different platforms, Twitch, where you have people delivering mostly image-based content that, is very superficial and doesn't help us get to any closer to the truth. And it's designed like that. And it's also designed for maximum conflict. It's also designed to trigger you. There's no other way to say it. It's designed, and we know that. I'm not saying anything. I know I'm not saying anything new under the sun. It's designed to trigger us and cause our amygdala to explode and rage at the keyboard, rage on our keyboards, which is one of the reasons I kind of late have been starting to steer clear of social media. But in that chapter where he talks about imageology, he also gets to a concept that I've been kind of hitting on throughout this monologue, is the idea of the only reality that you can really trust is the one that you see. And he reflects on a distant relative who grew up in a village and knew the news of the village because she heard it and saw it for herself among the people around her. And that in today's world of imageology, it just makes it harder to cope, to make sense of reality, because a lot of the things that we're seeing through the media are filtered through biases, are designed to enrage us, are designed to mislead us, and are designed to drive us all crazy, honestly. And it makes it really hard. And so I think that is a key component of Moloch, the Metacrisis, and the whole situation that we are in. And non-teleological answer to that is just to say, yeah, it is what it is, and I'm not going to judge it. I'm just going to accept it for what it is and work toward taking the time to make as much sense of it as I can, recognizing that ultimately the only thing I have direct control over is the world around me, the world directly surrounding me. And only thing I can do from a non-teleological perspective, and maybe it's even broader than that, a post-tragic perspective, is to make that part of the world as good as I can, because I can't solve global catastrophes. The forces are just beyond any one of us, and then sadly, I hate to say it, it's beyond most groups. So that's my little improvised rant on non-teleological thinking and the meta-crisis. So I hope you enjoyed that. Definitely recommend checking out Steinbeck's works if you haven't read them, especially chapter 14 of the Log from the Sea of Cortez. If you're interested in learning more about non-teleological thinking, he does talk about leadership in that and non-teleological thinking, and ways to consider and use non-teleological thinking in more detail than I have shared. But if you like this, make sure to hit like, share, comment, subscribe, and we'll post another episode next week. Talk to you all soon. Bye now.